Back once again. Hasn't this been a lot of fun so far today? This has been good, right? Food's good. Still have food out. In New York, when the food was gone, the food was gone. You kept thinking they were going to bring out more trays of food, and they never did. So if you're that guy that waits to the end, talks to everyone, you're like, I'm going to get that food at the end, I'm just going to scoop up everything that's left. Yeah, it didn't work so great that day. So we want to once again thank you guys for being here. Next up, we have another chat, and this one I'm really looking forward to. It's between two gentlemen that I know you're going to enjoy. Back in 1 minute, that 1 minute is up. We're back now, and we're going to be talking about building a future with quality content, also with a quality audience, I'm sure. And it is our good friend John Cole from earlier in the day, but he is going to be discussing this topic with Chris Taylor, who's the CIO of Telegraph Media, and someone that I'm very much looking forward to hearing from today. Please welcome John Cole and Chris Taylor.
Thank you, Tyler.
Good.
All right, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to be here. So, Chris, tell me about being a CIO. Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get into being a CIO? And tell us
That's a long and quite ugly story. I started out in the forces, went into management consulting about almost 20 years ago. Rapidly learned that management consulting really meant technology consulting. Did a few assignments with media. Quite enjoyed it, was offered a job by EMAP PLC that some people might remember used to be a monster kind of multimedia company at the time. Joined the team there and have stayed in media ever since.
Yeah, nice. And we're talking about a quality audience. How would you define a quality audience? I think we all know the Telegraph, even though it's not from the UK. How do you define it internally?
So it's really interesting. I think our view of it has changed a lot, actually, particularly in recent months. We used to be focused at the Telegraph really on two things: the pursuit of subscribers, originally print and then latterly print and digital subscribers, and the pursuit of scale. And like a lot of publishers in the room today, I would imagine, we used to run our business largely on digital ad revenue based on that scale. But our views changed a lot recently, actually, and now we're much more interested in what we would call identified scale rather than that anonymous scale. So we still reach circa 100 million people a month, but we're particularly interested in those people who will register with us, which isn't necessarily a new idea, but I think it's become increasingly important.
Yeah, because we had Nick Rockwell, who's the CTO of the New York Times at Pubtelligence in New York, and I think he broke the story, actually, that they were making more money from subscribers than they were from digital ad revenue for the first time. So they're kind of cracking the code. Is that your plan?
Yeah, I think that is definitely the plan. And I think it's great to see what's happening at the New York Times and at the Washington Post. I think the media dynamics in America are a bit different from here in the UK. I mean, we have very high quality free options like the BBC and the Guardian and so on. They don't really have that. So I think we should look at that as a lead indicator of the trends in the UK, but not necessarily expect an exact replica here. We definitely see growth in digital subscriptions. And I think as these debates around revenue models in media play out, it really feels to me, and it's certainly the case at the Telegraph, that the idea of digital subscriptions as the primary revenue stream is starting to win. I say primary rather than only, though, because we make a deliberate distinction that we want a vibrant, rich digital ad business, hopefully one that's enhanced by those registered, identified audience. But we also have some super affiliate e-commerce businesses which also need that scale audience as well.
Because don't answer this if you don't want to, but what sort of percentage do you get from your affiliate deals? Because I noticed a lot of Telegraph offers on the site, and so you've got subscriptions revenue, you've got your ad revenue, and then you have these other affiliate deals where you might own the business or you're sending the traffic away to get paid on a commission-only basis. What's the split?
Yeah, so just to be clear, all of our affiliate deals are exactly that. They're super affiliates. So apart from the subscriptions business and obviously the newspaper business, we don't own those ourselves.
I see.
So they're all percentage-based deals based on the volumes that we send through, which I'm sure are no different from those that everybody else enjoys. I can't give you the actual numbers, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I think at the moment we see kind of digital advertising and digital subscriptions as kind of equal. And we see a lot of growth in that that affiliate side, but particularly where we can see a close link between the editorial mission of the Telegraph and those kind of businesses. For us, the biggest example of that is travel. So if you search for best hotels in any city in Europe, the Telegraph result will be the first organic result that comes up. You read an independent review written by one of our professional journalists. They've reviewed sort of 12,000 best hotels in the world. And there's the opportunity then to book through booking.com, whether the review is good or bad. It's entirely up to your judgment at that point.
Yeah.
That kind of flywheel that mixes commercial business with the core editorial mission but keeps those Chinese walls sacrosanct, that works pretty well, we found.
Because I've noticed that Telegraph has done really well in organic search over the last few years. Tell us, how did you do that?
Well, there's a couple of things to that. And firstly, the Telegraph was the first newspaper online back in 1994. Okay, so there is huge equity in the domain in general. Okay, and we also invested a lot of time and effort about 10 years ago in really training and equipping the newsroom with the knowledge and the skills and the tools to know how to publish digital content in a way that would index well in search. Okay, now some of that has been, deliberately modified a bit in the last few years, actually, because it's important that you don't let writing to index well in search start to become the main priority. That we would never allow that to happen. So we kind of exactly. We've reasserted some of that, and some of the headlines that you see published digitally by us are shorter, more similar to the kind of headlines you would have seen in print. But having that skills and that knowledge in the newsroom, as well as all of those years of practice, is the thing that's made all the difference.
Yeah. And what levers, I don't know if we actually got into what a CIO does, but what are the levers that you pull in your job to?
Yeah, so I think ask a CIO what they do, you'll get a different answer. I mean, I'm the senior technologist, I suppose, at the Telegraph. I look after all tech, however you would describe it, and our digital products. And I think in terms of things like engagement and trying to grow that quality audience, there's a few things. I mean, firstly, we should recognize that the main reason that people come to a product like ours is for the content, okay? And the journalism, which is at the heart of what we do, is the main way to attract people into the franchise and encourage them to deepen their relationship, to subscribe with us potentially, to engage more fully. So that's always front and center. There are other things that you can do around user experience, around presence on platforms, and we try and think of our kind of digital product strategy as a series of 3 different layers. We have some products which are there to attract people into the brand, so that might be our presence on third-party platforms, on voice devices. We have others that are designed to engage people, and then we have some which are designed purely for our subscribers. So all of these things happen on our website. Our smartphone app is there to try and deepen engagement, and our Edition app, which is primarily created for tablets, is there purely for subscribers. So everything's got its role to play, and often several different roles at once.
So do you put ads in the tablet version for your subscribers?
Yes, we do, actually. The approach we take there is slightly different from that you would take in a kind of more standard web-centric advertising approach. So we actually put the same ads as appear in the newspaper. So if you buy an ad in the newspaper with us, you're actually buying the Telegraph edition audience, and I know that our friends at the Times do the same thing. But you're accessing that edition consuming audience in print and in tablet edition. And that's deliberate because it's a very high value audience, and actually when you look into the details of consumption, dwell time, depth of engagement, tablet app consumption actually looks an awful lot like newspaper consumption, much more so than it does like web consumption.
Because I remember growing up and my dad used to read a newspaper. My kids don't see me reading newspapers anymore. How are things going to look? I mean, we were talking earlier with Betsy about Instagram and Snapchat audiences. How are you getting new users in to use the Telegraph?
Yeah, so I think it's a myth that newspapers are going to disappear. I don't believe that for one second. And we don't see evidence of that, actually. We see...
You mean physical newspapers?
Physical newspapers, yeah. We see pretty steady newspaper circulation, not just us, but the broadsheets, as you would call them in general here in the UK, are now in a relatively solid position. And I think anyone who's reading a newspaper, physical newspaper now, is making a format choice. Everybody knows there are alternatives available. And long may that continue. I certainly think it'll outstrip my career. The interesting question, though, is, whereas you saw your father reading the Telegraph, and maybe that's how you were first acquainted with the brand, it's reasonable to hypothesize that doesn't happen so much now. So that's why we take that approach around using new and emergent digital platforms as a way to encourage people to bump into the brand, get them to read a bit of content, and hopefully attract them into the franchise. You mentioned Snapchat, which is probably the best example of that. So we publish on Snapchat an edition in the Discover section. We're still the only kind of premium news publisher in the UK to do that. It's worked really well for us. We reach 3 million teenagers a month, which is way in excess of anything we anticipated.
That's surprising.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting because it shows, I think, that actually young people, whilst they might not necessarily identify with the more traditional formats, are still very apt to engage with the content itself, which is great, right? Because those people, we don't expect them to subscribe tomorrow, but maybe they will in 10 or 15 years. They are the readers of the future. And actually, that kind of strategy is an important part of managing that whole funnel, even if that could be a 10-year journey.
That's almost like an Amazon kind of time frame, isn't it? The last 10 years, I've seen Amazon's long game in e-commerce, sort of getting us all to change our behaviour over time.
Oh, too right, yeah. They are impressive.
They are impressive. So Telegraph taking the long game. I like it. What about international versus domestic? Because obviously I'm a Brit. I used to live in the States, and I would actually go to the Telegraph and read it from the States because I miss my UK news. So how are you tackling international?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So we are a UK publication, UK headquartered. We're writing primarily for a UK audience, but more than 50% of our digital audience is overseas, and a very large chunk of it, about 30 million people a month, is in North America. And that is actually, I suppose you'd say, by accident rather than design. And it's definitely an opportunity for us. I think we recently opened a bureau in Silicon Valley as part of our intention to start to cover technology in more depth. And that's proving pretty good. I think the interesting thing for us, and I would suggest for any publisher, is being quite clear about what you're trying to do in those countries. So I don't think you would ever see us trying to write US news for a US audience. But I think we may well start to take much more interest in what resonates particularly in North America, maybe present and propose things differently. It's all discussions that are in the early stages at the moment. But I would definitely think that we will look at country by country rather than trying to have some sort of rest of the world strategy that just treats everywhere outside the UK as if they happen to be the same.
Well, certainly in North America, I think that's a good idea. And actually, that brings me to my next question, which is on monetization. Obviously, in the wake of fake news and the way that things have panned out in the States and the uptick in subscriptions, I'm really surprised by that over the last 5 years. Who would have predicted that subscription revenue would have become a thing for news publishers? How are you doing? I know roughly how the New York Times have done it. How are you doing it? How are you going about making money out of subscribers? Can you kind of tell us how you're doing that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think James Murdoch at News Corp did predict it, actually, when everyone else thought he was crazy.
Well,
but
yeah, I guess they failed, though, didn't they?
I don't know. I think the Times are doing pretty well.
Yeah, now.
Yeah.
But I mean,
yeah,
I
definitely.
guess when they rolled out their payment wall early. Then
Yeah, well, someone's got to go first,
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's great to see. It's great to see the success of subscriptions globally, particularly, like we said earlier, in North America. How do we make money from them? Well, really, I mean, one of the advantages there are a few advantages to subscriptions kind of being the dominant digital revenue stream. One of them, of course, is just from a financial point of view, subscription revenue in whatever game you're in is reliable, recurring revenue. And because the nature of what a subscription is, you know the individual, you've got a one-to-one relationship, you can do so much more about engagement, both on and off platform, personalization, enriching experience. And that's really powerful, actually, if you want to build an ever deeper, more long-lasting relationship with those people. It's also great for the journalism because actually subscriptions is the modern digital business model which is most closely aligned to the pure core mission of journalism. And actually that's really helpful because to get a decent working partnership going, you need the newsroom to be with the commercial endeavor, and it's the ultimate kind of symbiosis, that, which is great. We are pretty careful with our subscribers. We don't currently moderate the advertising experience, for example, that they experience. We don't dial it down like some publishers do. We continue to discuss those kind of options, but we prefer to try and add more and more value into the bundle. So experiences, events, features, personalization around the edges of the journalistic experience, those kind of things.
Yeah. And what about the non-registered visitors? How are you monetizing them? So
any non-registered visitor really is hopefully the registered visitor of tomorrow, yeah, and then ultimately hopefully the subscriber. So I mean that's very clear for us. Anonymous people, super welcome. We'd love them to register. Once they register, that's great, but we'd love them ultimately to subscribe. But when somebody first arrives with us in an anonymous state, they'll see a lot of encouragement to register. Some of that's access to content, some of it's promotional messaging.
So you put up like a to continue reading, register here kind of thing, right?
Yeah, we do actually. We have two approaches to that. Some content you have to register to read. Some of the, what we would call the premium content, is the content you have to subscribe to read, okay? And you with the subscription content, if you come to that anonymously, you definitely see a prompt saying you have to either register to trial this or become a subscriber to enjoy more of this.
What are the bounce rates like from people who come to those pages?
Well, it varies. Bounce rates on registration walls are pretty low, actually. I think it depends on the source and the kind of audience, but certainly for people who have come directly to the Telegraph, rather than perhaps being referred through social media or whatever, they are pretty apt, and we see some pretty good conversion rates. And I think, having spent some time of my career working in digital subscriptions, I think we see conversion rates on the subscription part that are kind of as up there with as good as you see in any publisher, really.
And do you do different offers for different types of visitors? Do you sort of detect any kind
Yes, we do.
Signals?
Yeah, we do. We have what we refer to as the intelligent paywall. So we have lots of different propositions in the kind of product catalog, I suppose you would describe it. And we segment our audience to quite a granular level. And we take the segment that they're in, the content they're reading, and use those two reference points to put forward the appropriate creative and or commercial offer that we think is most likely to lead to them converting.
And how's it going?
Really, well, that really works actually. Using that to replace much more standard kind of one size fits all, that we really do see an uplift. Obviously, you've got to manage it though.
Yeah, that's good. And how are you finding? A lot of publishers have been talking about the problem of retargeting on their direct sales. So, for example, Facebook team will go out and say, "Hey, you want Telegraph readers? I've got Telegraph readers. You can get them in Facebook, right? And we've got all this data around it." How are you guys getting on with that as a kind of competitive threat?
Yeah, so I mean that's not new, of course.
Yeah,
it's been with us for some years, yeah, and I think we're in the same position, general position as everybody else. Part of the reason that we focused in the last year or so on getting people to register with us is because if we have that body of identified people about whom we have a lot of declared data and information, and they're also in a premium publishing context, which I think makes a huge difference. So if you've got the data and the insight and the information, and you've got the context, that's really quite powerful. So when you're competing in the market from an advertising point of view, those two things, you can go to people like Facebook or whatever and get the data. You can't get it in context, and I think that makes all the difference.
I think the thing that I've always struggled with is trying to measure context or measure intent. How do you think about that? How do you measure it? I'm not expecting an answer actually, but I would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we have done some specific campaign analysis with certain key advertising clients, and we have been able to show, we believe, that it does have a positive upweighting factor. And I think when you also think about the changes that have happened with GDPR and the general kind of trend towards ever more regulation, I think in many respects I'm quite optimistic about what that means for a publisher in particular, because if you roll back sort of 10, 15 years, digital advertising was all about context, and a lot of the control of that context was in the hands of publishers, and publishers have been disintermediated to a degree in the period over that time, willingly in many cases. And actually, I think with the hardening of those rules about what you can do with data and how you can treat someone anonymously, we'll actually see a resurgence of that. And it's less about trying to argue the case for context. I think we might find that actually in time, context becomes an essential component that people need to have to be able to carry out an effective campaign.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the way that we look at it is the behavior of the visitor when they come to sort of things like scroll depth, how long they're spending on the page, how many pages they look at, and how many words per page, that sort of thing. And then
completely.
The numbers on top.
Yeah, so to give you an example, I said earlier on, someone reading our digital edition, our tablet edition, spent 40 minutes reading that product. I mean, nobody spends 40 minutes in a session reading the newsfeed on their Facebook account.
That's crazy.
They're not comparable environments, at all.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. So here's an interesting one for you, and I did give this one to you before, but subscription versus the free internet. Are we going to, do you envisage a world in the future where richer people get access to good quality information and the poorer people don't?
I think that's as unpleasant and difficult a question as it was when you warmed me up to it. So what do I think about that? So I think many of us were around when the internet kind of first started, and there was a philosophy around it's got to be free, doesn't it? I think a lot of that has changed actually, because you have well-established digital subscription propositions from the likes of Netflix and Spotify, and a lot of the people consuming digital media now have grown up into doing so in a world where it was already well established that people would pay for high quality media, right? So I think some of that moral, philosophical debate, we're kind of through some of that. It's a very interesting question about whether or not you're going to end up with a two-tier internet. We certainly would seek to try and straddle that, even if it were to happen. And so a couple of facts for you. If you buy the Telegraph newspaper every day, it's going to cost you more than £10 a week. Okay.
That's quite a lot. Now,
if you take a digital subscription from the Telegraph, £2 a week. Now, those newspaper kind of prices are not new, okay? And many people of all income demographics have chosen to buy their newspaper of choice through the ages every day, okay? And now you can get a digital subscription to us or to any of our competitors for significantly less than people were used to paying for the physical copy. And I think that is quite a democratizing proposition. If anything, it's a bit more accessible than it used to be. But equally, if you go to the Telegraph, you won't see a hard paywall on all of the content. So it varies and the editor's team control it, but maybe 30 or so, 35% of the content has a paywall, and the rest is deliberately open and free to air. And it's free to air on our own platforms, and we also disseminate it as far and wide as we can. And that's because we feel that there is part of digital publishing is about still being relevant, still having a presence, and there are parts of the journalistic mission where you need to get your content out far and wide. Some things it's just not appropriate to put a paywall on. And we would always continue that strategy. It works well for us because it's good for attracting people into the brand, but it also makes the journalism accessible to all, certainly to a quite substantial degree.
And I'm not going to give my views on that. Well, maybe I will. I think that everybody deserves the ability to be able to get hold of good information.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you're going to keep most of it free.
Well, I didn't say we're going to keep most of it free.
We're off the record here, folks.
We don't say we're going to keep most of it free. I said that we keep a certain body of it free to air, deliberately so.
Yeah.
But we also, we offer a 30-day free trial on the subscription as well. And like I said, it's an awful lot cheaper than buying a newspaper every day, which people have done for generations. So I think
he's selling to us now. I like it. So what advice, I've got a lot of independent owner-operators here. What advice would you give to the people here who might have a small portfolio or they've got one or two big sites? What advice would you give from what you've learned in your day job?
Okay, great. So it very much depends on context. A few things I have learned are focus is key. Okay, especially it's very easy in digital publishing to be attracted by the shiny new thing, and sometimes there's a role for that. And if you've got a reasonable scale, maybe you can afford to indulge that. But I think it strikes me that to do fewer things but to do them as well as you possibly can is better than spreading yourself extremely thin. So I would definitely say that. I think the customer and user experience really is an important place to invest time. And one of the challenges I think a lot of people have had is it's hard to measure that. Obviously, there are capabilities now to do that perhaps more correctly than ever before, but it's very hard to measure that. Whereas it's very easy to measure the return from, say, a low-value disruptive ad format. And when you're weighing those two up, it's easy to go for the money. But I would encourage anyone to nurture and protect that customer experience. That doesn't mean for 1 second that there can't be a perfectly appropriate and quite high value home for advertising in that, and indeed I think there should be. In many respects it enriches the experience, but I think it needs to be treated with care. And I am a big fan of the idea of the subscription, and I think if you have got a publication and you take care of that customer experience, and particularly if you've got something unique, then there's every reason to think that you could get people to subscribe for it, even if it's on a relatively modest scale. But that in and of itself gives you that reliable, repeatable revenue stream, which is a powerful thing for your organization to have if it doesn't have it already.
I'm sure that a lot of the guys here would like subscription revenue. Yeah, that sounds good. So one last question, and then I'm going to open it up because I know that you've got to dash off after this. We've only got 5 minutes.
Certainly.
So glass half full, glass half empty for digital publishers?
Definitely glass half full. I am naturally an optimist anyway. Yeah. And I actually think, having spent most of my career in this game, I actually think we're more than through the worst of it. Okay. So I think you're starting to see, like I said, you see subscriptions becoming the dominant model. That's the one that's best for publishers. You're starting to see much greater capabilities around data, artificial intelligence, like the session earlier, the ability to use that to augment and personalize the experience in a way which we used to talk about, but was actually really, really hard to do well. And now it's starting to become a lot more possible. I think it's a really vibrant, interesting sector. And I also think that things like data regulation actually gradually starts to return power and control to the publisher and to that one-to-one relationship, which in the end will be quite a good thing for us. Yeah. So yeah, pretty confident.
I'm definitely in agreement with you on that. I think things are looking good for the future because, well, also they're clearing out a lot of fraud in the ad exchanges.
Completely.
TXT. I think things are only going to be getting better for publishers.
Yeah, I think the ad industry in particular has done loads in recent times to address that kind of stuff. And obviously it's like a never-ending problem, isn't it? I mean, you can work on that forever, but it definitely feels like there is a real partnership emerging on that side as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. Tyler, yep. Can we have a hand up? We've got a roving mic here. Anybody? Down the front here.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for the talk. Very quick question, I hope, for you. Some newspapers implement a paywall on specific articles, like I think you guys do and Business Insider does, whereas other newspapers go down the route, you can read 10 or 20 articles per month for free and then you have to pay. Do you see pros and cons with both of these options?
Yeah, there are definitely pros and cons. At a very sort of summary level, if you have a paywall on all of your content, I would argue that the metered model works quite well. If you choose to deliberately put some out for free, then I think the metered model doesn't work so well on a more limited body. The challenge with a meter when you haven't got a whole, everything behind a paywall is it's quite hard to be clear about what the proposition is, because you might be reading a long form article that's been years in the making and be reading it completely free, and I might be reading a piece of copy that's not much different from a newswire and being expected to pay for it, precisely because I'm actually more loyal reader than you are. And I think that's pretty difficult to reconcile. So I personally favour when you've got a model like ours where you deliberately publish a proportion as subscription and a proportion always free, I prefer the hard paywall approach. But there's people who would debate exactly the opposite if they were here rather than me.
One more question. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a really brilliant talk. That was very insightful and...
one sec. We're just going to get your mic turned on.
Hello?
Yeah.
That's it.
Oh, right. Thanks for a really brilliant talk. That was great. It's really good to hear more about subscriptions. I'm just wondering, this might be a little low level, but in terms of having a paywall come up on an existing article that you've organically ranked really well for, as you said earlier, you're doing great with that, which is awesome. But have you found having the paywall causes you problems with that, or is it kind of not an issue?
Yeah, so it's definitely the case that if you've got a paywall on your content, that particular piece of content won't rank as well, precisely because of the bounce rate that you'll get from the paywall. There are things you can do in the way you set that article up that allows the Googlebot to still spider the article, and Google will recognize, you can flag that it's a paid-for piece of content. And in some of the initiatives, like the Subscribe with Google initiative, that's a fairly new one, if someone is a subscriber, they will actively see those results. But there's no getting away from the fact that when you put a hard wall on something, it ranks less well. One of the things we have done is if we see a story going viral or becoming really popular, or perhaps we get to the point where it's starting to become really quite in-depth and quite interesting, then we potentially will encourage people to register for that, even if previously it was free to air. Where we do that, because it's already developed that equity, it tends to still rank pretty well. But if it goes out as a pure kind of paywall from day one, it's always going to be a challenge.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, one more. We're just going a little bit over time. Go ahead.
So Chris, it's a really great talk. So my question is what do you think about the voice technology in the digital publication? Because right now, Alexa Home and Google Home is also coming. So do we really need to push our content in such kind of a way that those consumers, the next future consumers, can also have that kind of a highlighting portion?
Yes, it's a great question. So what's the kind of role of voice in all of this? So it's interesting. I think voice is obviously very new. We took the decision to make sure we were launch partners for both the Google Home and for the Alexa here in the UK. Did that deliberately because we felt, whilst you can't follow every trend, this feels like it's got legs. And that's not to say that it's come of age for publishing use cases yet. But, if you just think about how many people have got Alexa devices or Google Homes in their house, Google Assistant is actually going to be on the smartphone, which means be a lot more accessible. And I think it feels like the beginning of a proper revolution. Don't quite know what it's going to mean for us yet, but we decided that we wanted to experiment with it from the start because it felt more like it was going to go somewhere than some of the other things we've seen in the last few years.
Okay, that's all the time that we've got. Thank you very much, Chris
Pleasure.
Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
CIO of-
Cheers. Thanks, John. Really good.